Well, Robin, it's been a long while. Neither of us could remember when you came out to Australia to do the Hope and Health conference, but we think it was 2018 or 19, but we're getting too old to remember dates.
One or the other, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I think maybe whatever it was. Somebody can look it up.
Yeah, somebody can look it
Sure,
up.
there's some record of it somewhere. It was
Um,
lovely.
yeah, we certainly greatly enjoyed it, and so we've just posted the video, YouTube video of you giving some of the highlights, I think, of that last couple hundred years, people who'd come around to universalism. I like saying cosmic redemption, but whatever. Uh,
Yeah, that's better.
and I think you had four pathways that people came through. Um, can you just quickly remind us what they were?
I was going to
Can you
ask you to
remember?
remind me. I mean, I did that ages ago. I can't remember
I'll,
what was
I'll,
in it.
well, one was scripture.
You prompt me, and I will.
Scripture was the
One was
first one.
what? Sorry,
Scripture.
what was it?
The first one was scripture.
Scripture. Yeah.
Just studied the
Yes.
Bible.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the reasons I think cosmic redemption or universal restoration or whatever you want to call it keeps recurring is people reading the Bible and thinking, puzzling over bits and things that don't seem to make sense within the framework that they've inherited, in which there isn't cosmic redemption, and then they find these texts that seem to promise so much more. And so the pressure of the Bible is one of those things that pushes various people, and often over a long period of time. So
Mm-mm.
one of the people I think I talked about was Elhanan Winchester, and he uh, dismissed the idea, first of all. This was an 18th century guy. He dismissed the idea, first of all, out of hand. But, some of the arguments, and they were the biblical arguments, kept gnawing away at him at the back of his mind, and he couldn't get rid of them. So after a couple of years, he just thought, I need to figure out what I think about this. So he locks himself away with the Bible, and he does nothing but read the Bible and then he comes out fully convinced from reading scripture. This is the thing.
Mm.
So one of the pivotal, I think, really probably well, certainly non-negotiable and definitely central things that drives people towards universal restoration is the Bible
Yeah.
and reading it in a different kind of way. And sometimes once you start to make that shift and see it differently, all sorts of texts open up. And I mean, another woman who I don't recall whether I talked about her, Hannah Whitall Smith. Did I talk about her? She
I
was
can't
a
remember.
holiness preacher.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. 19th century holiness preacher, very, very influential in revivalism, evangelical revivalism. In fact, she was the one of the forces behind the Keswick movement, the
Mm,
inspirations
yeah,
behind the
interesting.
Keswick
Yeah.
movement. But as she and several other inspirations behind the Keswick movement were Universalists, which I
I
think
didn't
would have
know
more.
that. How interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, sorry, slightly diverging, the Broadlands conferences, from which they arose, there were several folk, including Andrew Jukes, who
Mm.
I don't know if I mentioned him. He was a really interesting theological universalist with an evangelical background. Anyway, she said, getting back to the point, that it was, when suddenly she was reading scripture and seeing all sorts of stuff that just came alive to her, and suddenly it made sense because in her conversion experience, not to Christianity but to universal restoration, she was struggling, with the issue of hell, and she was on a tram, and then the scripture text from Isaiah, he will see the travail of his soul and be satisfied. Christ will see the travail of his soul and be satisfied. How? And she's thinking, how can he be satisfied unless the people for whom he dies are um, redeemed? It doesn't make sense. And suddenly it all kind of comes together for her. And all sorts of other texts subsequently then become unlocked, which sort of reinforces this.
Interesting.
She talks about it in her autobiography as if she was instantly convinced, but in some of her correspondence, it seems that she was still, you know, wrestling with some scriptures for a little bit after that until she was fully convinced. But scripture then was pivotal for her and for I mean, all of them really, in some way, at some point. For some people, it's the thing that kickstarts it. For other people, it's something else that kickstarts it, but then they go back and look at scripture and see it differently. And so scripture always figures in there somewhere, but exactly what role it plays, it's not necessarily the instigator of the journey,
Yes.
but it can be.
I
Mhm.
I marvel at my experience because my background's literature, so and particularly poetry. So I'm very attuned to language in a way that I'm not, say, to mathematics. Mathematics, I have to work out. Language is totally intuitive. And of course, having been a Christian since a child, and serious about my faith, I know the scripture very well. And yeah, I loved Romans 5, and um, used to give talks on it, and yet when universal salvation dawned on me, the obviousness of the parallelism of the argument of all and all, I
Mm.
said, how on earth could I have ever missed
Yeah.
this? I mean, it is so
Yeah.
obvious. It's the clearly common sense reading of it that all will be saved. You might try and argue, as people try and argue out of it. Oh, no, it doesn't mean all. Well, but they're on the back foot. That's a defensive thing. And what just it absolutely intrigues me, Robin, is how on earth could I, with all of my literary sensitivity, have read this through a paradigm for years and years and years, and it never occurred to me what it was saying, the most obvious thing it was saying.
And it's partly because we're always reading, whenever we read any part of the Bible, we're reading it in light of our understanding of the whole.
Yeah,
And we read the whole in light of our understanding of the part. So there's this sort of dialogue. Um, and so if we understand certain other passages to be teaching eternal hell, then we kind of bring, and rightly, I think, we bring that with us. We're mindful of that as we're reading Romans 5, and so we think, well, it can't mean something that doesn't fit with that. It's got to mean something else. And we might not even consciously think that,
no, I think
but that's
unconsciously that's what we're doing, and but
unconsciously we're thinking, well, we know this is the case, so and I think that locks. It didn't seem to work the other way around so often, though, does it? People don't kind of read the hell passages having read the other ones, and we think and thinking, well, we know what this means, but that's because we become Christians into a community, into a tradition, and we inherit ways of reading.
yeah,
And that's a good thing. I mean, I'm not dismissing that. That's a good thing that we do that. But we're always reforming. We're always sitting under the judgment of Scripture. So, and well, of God, and through Scripture. And so we're constantly needing to reinterpret and reread it, and allow it to challenge us rather than making it conform
yeah,
to what we
completely,
think.
completely. And I
Mm.
think one thing I appreciated, not just about the talk we posted recently, but also the work that you and Ilari have done, but particularly you with the recent book on a larger hope. Sorry, when I say recent, I mean you wrote the second volume, which was the last few hundred years. I really have long realized there's one of two ways of approaching any big topic. One of which is systematically with an internal logic. The example I am thinking about is economics. If somebody tried to explain economics to me, and I'm not an economist, they could go through various conceptual models and lay it all out, and I don't do too badly with that. But there's an entirely other way, which Neil Ferguson, who's one of these
The
people,
historian guy.
yeah, the historian and economist. I think he wrote a
Yeah,
book called Money, which was, well, I'm going
he
to tell you
did.
the
Yeah,
story of money,
yeah.
and that makes it much more accessible, but in a way is more authentic because the frameworks we have get built up over time, and so
Mhm.
I valued you going into the stories of how these people came to that view. So
Mm.
anyway, I thought people would be
So that
interested.
was one of the four things.
That's one of the
Scripture.
four. Well, they can listen to
I can't
your
remember what the others were.
yeah,
I
but
know, I remember two of them there actually. Yeah. Oh, I remember all of them. they've all come back to me.
They
Yeah.
all come back to you. Cool. Well,
Yeah.
but the point of this is I thought it'd be intriguing to talk about your story. Um,
Mm.
so if we begin at the beginning, from memory, you did not grow up in a Christian family, is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So I didn't, although for reasons known to somebody, presumably, but that don't make much sense to me, my parents, who were not Catholics, sent me to a convent when I was tiny. So I was taught by nuns.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and so I did actually believe in God back then, just because it's what you did.
Yeah.
Um, it didn't even cross my mind not to. I was tiny. It was sort of preschool. So I was there
Yeah.
about 3 years. I enjoyed that. So maybe deep down in my psyche, there was always this God thing going on. But yeah, after that, we didn't go to church except perhaps at Christmas. Uh, Utterly tedious. Hated it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, so so when I became a Christian as a teenager, um, I became quite fundamentalist. I don't regret that for a
How did you
minute.
become a Christian? What happened?
Oh, I fancied this girl at, at
Robert.
school.
Well, that's the best reason out. Yeah. Okay. Keep going.
Well, and so she was part of this group of Christians at school,
Yes.
and they kept going, "Come to church," and I go, "No, I mean, I don't like you that much." I didn't say that. I was much too shy. Um, and then they had this rock concert on at the church, so I thought I'll go to that. I can handle a rock concert, and it was quite good. It was blues, more blues, which actually I think I'd enjoy more now than then. But what really struck me was the way they talked about Jesus as if he was alive and relevant. It
Yeah.
was quite powerful for me. So I started going to their youth group then, and over a period of months became more persuaded. And then at Spring Harvest, which is this annual convention, that the national convention they have here, I made the decision or whatever the phrase is. And then I went all out and got quite fundamentalist because I knew nothing about what the Bible, well, stuff you hear at school about Noah's Ark and baby Jesus and stuff. I didn't know much about the Bible at all. So I just anything I was taught and I read loads of stuff, I believed it all in a very inflexible way. And I had to do that because I had no way of discerning what was central, what was peripheral, what was up for discussion, what was, I just had no way of knowing. Um, so universalism was obviously false, and all the churches I went to were evangelical, and it wasn't even a discussion, it was a given.
Mm.
So I took it as a given
So
until
just before we get onto that, I am also interested in your educational interest. I mean, what did you study and what did you study at university?
yeah, well, I started off training as a primary school teacher because I wanted to be a missionary and I left it too late in life. Well, I was doing the wrong, what we call they don't exist anymore, but what we called O levels. So they were like things you do when you're 16, whatever your equivalent is, to be a doctor. So I thought, I can't do that to be a missionary. What can I do? I can be a teacher. So I went to do primary school teaching. And the first year is a 4 year degree. So the first year of it, in this place I was at, which was a Methodist college, you just do a subject. So I did RE. And that's all I did apart from a teaching practice at the end of the year for a couple of weeks. And then the final 3 years are all focused on the teaching stuff. But I enjoyed the REs, the religious studies, so much. I thought, why don't I just switch into the second year of a theology degree? Because they also ran one of those. And then I can do a year's post-grad teacher training. And so in the same amount of time I'd be qualified as a teacher, I might get to do more theology, which I'd found quite interesting. Because since I'd become a Christian, I'd read lots. I was always asking questions. and wanting to know things and reading the Bible a lot. I guess I had a lot of stuff to make up for. It was my teenage rebellion being a Christian. See, so so most people kind of go off and do all this stuff. So being holy was my way of being rebellious.
How did your
I
parents
mean,
handle it?
they thought my mum thought it was a passing phase.
Okay.
Um, yeah, my dad probably hoped it was a passing phase. I'm seeing them both on Sunday. So
Okay. Well, so they know it's not a passing phase.
they know that, yes, yes. Um, they're still neither of them anyway. Neither of them are Christians yet, but they
But
will be.
they will be indeed. So then
Anyway,
keep the story going.
that was my thing. So while I was there, actually, while I was there, I got to know John Wenham. John Wenham, who wrote the Cambridge Greek thing, and he was one of the founders of KICU, I think, OIQ, one of them or the other, one the Cambridge or Oxford Christian Union. I can't remember. Anyway, he was persuaded me to be an annihilationist on hell because he had all this illegal literature. He was very conservative evangelical, but he had all of this stuff that you couldn't buy because nobody would publish it. Edward Fudge and people like that. Basil Atkinson, and these kind of books. And so I read all that stuff, and I was quite persuaded that the eternal to conscious torment was wrong. So that was, I suppose, the start of the journey. But an eternal hell was still non-negotiable for me. It wasn't until I was thinking on an entirely different issue, namely the question of free will and God's sovereignty and providence and human freedom, that I started to realize that there might be more of a problem because I'd always argued that my best argument against for hell was to say, well, God doesn't want people to go to hell, but people choose of their free will to go, and God, can't force people because it wouldn't be free.
I think that's the most common, that is the most common sort of defense of hell. Yeah.
Yes, so that, and I felt that had some merit, except when I was in my Calvinist phases. And then it doesn't really work because God can bring about everything you freely choose is because God determines that you freely choose and stuff because they're determinists normally, not all of them. So if I was when I was a Calvinist, that argument wouldn't work. Calvinists have got much more of a problem. As an Arminian, that was the argument I'd use. But then I read a book by William Lane Craig, which argued that even on a libertarian view of free will, which is what Arminians tend to use, where God doesn't force you, God can't force the choices, they're down to you, they originate in you. Even on that view, God can get God's will done, right? And so immediately I'm thinking, well, this is cool. I mean, this is like you can have your cake and eat it, but that does create a problem for hell, right? But thankfully, he has a chapter on this in the book. So I was very excited to read this because I was getting a bit worried. And I read the chapter and I was desperate to believe him. And I came away really disappointed. I mean, quite concerned because I thought, this guy's really clever. And if that's the best argument you can come up with, it's not really very persuasive.
What was his
I still
argument?
knew that hell. Oh, well, it's a complicated philosophical argument. I mean, do you really want to know it?
No, but he argues for a hell within that framework.
Yeah, I have a discussion of it in an appendix of
Okay.
the Evangelical Universalist, and it's not that it's a logically impossible position to hold, the one that he defends. I don't think it's logically impossible. I just think it seems wildly implausible, and to feel that I'd have to believe something as implausible as that it just didn't sit well. So I read a whole bunch of stuff he wrote on hell, and each time, and he was criticizing this guy called Thomas Tolbert and showing how Thomas Tolbert's arguments didn't work. And I was more and more disturbed the more I read because I wanted to believe William Lane Craig because I knew that hell wasn't. But I actually found the arguments of the guy he was criticizing more persuasive, which is not what should be happening. So, for a variety of reasons, I contacted Thomas Talbot, and this was in the 90s, because one of my students, by then I was teaching in a sixth form college, which is 16 to 19-year-olds, and I was teaching philosophy. And one of my students wanted to do a thing on philosophy and hell. So I put her onto a bunch of stuff. And I contacted Thomas Talbot, and he sent a copy of his book, which I read. And I was, so for the first time, I wasn't persuaded at all. But it had loads of good arguments in it, a lots of
What's the
good
name of that
biblical
book?
arguments.
What's the book called? Relentless Love or
It's
something?
the
Or
inescapable love of
The
God, is it?
Inescapable
Or
Love?
the
Yeah.
inescapable love of God. It's the in something love of God.
Mhm.
And I always forget which. I think it's inescapable. And it was really, had some really persuasive arguments and some good biblical stuff, which some of which didn't persuade me, some of which I thought was good. But what it did persuade me is there's a lot more theologically and biblically going for this view than I'd ever imagined possible. I mean, I hadn't even considered it as an option. Whereas at that point, and the other guy was Keith DeRose, who had this article online about the Bible and universalism. And again, I read that, and um, and it was the same. There was some good arguments in it, particularly on all. Does all mean all? I mean, as a philosopher too, he's at Yale, and I thought, yeah, that's good. But some of the stuff I thought, there's a lot more stuff that you need to look at. So I spent the next 2 years looking at the Bible again, thinking, does this make sense? I mean, can it work? And at the end of the 2 years, well, increasingly over the 2 years, rather, I became more and more convinced that it could. So I suppose I had a gradual conversion that began with a problem that I couldn't make sense of, and then progressed to um, a hope that that the scripture might be more open to this, that proceeded to a conviction over time that actually you could read scripture very plausibly this way. Um,
When you were spending that couple of years looking at the scripture, was there any systematic way you were doing that, or were you just sort of hovering over were there any parts you were focusing on, or
oh gosh, yeah. So this is right. Well, I suppose there were, and this is going back to the mid to late 90s, around about 97, 98, that kind of time. Um, yeah, okay, so this might help me jog my memory. If you've read the Evangelical Universalist, that is what wasn't written to be a book. That was that's a tidied up version of my notes to myself
oh, okay.
that I made. And so the chapter on Revelation, obviously, then I'm saying this to myself to remember how it worked. Revelation clearly has some of the most difficult texts. I mean, chapter 14 and chapter 20 are the most, um, explicitly eternal conscious tormenty texts in the Bible. So they needed looking at. And so all of that whole chapter arose from a sort of sustained look at the book of Revelation. And obviously the teaching of Jesus. And so I had to look at hell text. But I think actually, I mean, another thing that fed into this was another thing that laid the foundation for this was about 95, or no, 93 or 94. I wanted to write an article for a journal, just some because this was before Tom Wright was really well known. I mean, everybody knows him now. But I was really impressed by his early stuff, and he was quite a person within scholarship, but he wasn't really so well known outside of that. And I wanted to sort of synthesize his big theological picture for students. So I mapped it all out in a diagram, um, and as a sort of way to visually present it. And I couldn't make it work. I gave up writing it because I couldn't make it work because it looked to me like I couldn't fit hell into the picture in a way that made sense. Tom Wright himself wouldn't agree with this. I mean, the only things he's ever written on universalism are arguments to argue that it's wrong, um, which is what I thought at the time. So, but I just thought this isn't working. This doesn't make sense. It because the hell doesn't fit into it properly. Anyway, so that was shelved, and I moved on. But when I came to think through the universalism thing, suddenly that came back to me. And I thought, you know what? Tom Wright's things would work a lot better if he was a universalist. Um, because suddenly his theology, I mean, he would think I was talking nonsense, but his theology seemed to make a lot more sense. If there are other things on which I think his theology would make more sense if he slightly tweaked them, but this was one of them. So in fact, the evangelical universalist meta narrative is really a sort of Tom Wright theology worked out the way I did it. I do it.
Mm.
Right. So that was also feeding into it. I've always thought in terms of scripture as a whole and the big picture and all of that kind of stuff. That's the way. So always when I'm thinking through this stuff, I'm thinking, but how does that affect this? And if you do that with this text, what does it mean for this text? And what does it, and how does, if this doctrine does this, how does it affect this doctrine and stuff? So I guess a lot of the way I was thinking through, I mean, it was systematic in the sense that I need to know that it makes sense of all the bits and how they impact each other, rather than just reading a passage and thinking, oh, I'm a universalist because this verse says this. And then you think, but how does that fit with the, I need to know how it fits with all the other bits. Otherwise, I might just blurt out that I'm a universalist and then find that it's incoherent. It
Yes.
doesn't. Yeah.
Well, that's a word
So
that
for me,
David Bentley Hart uses, I think, very instructively coherent. That so his criticism of Augustine is that in the end, it's incoherent, whereas Gregory of Nyssa was coherent. Um,
yeah,
and I think this idea, therefore, that clearly in the Bible we've got a really broad narrative, but the whole you can find it's got apparent contradictions all through it on almost everything. So you really need the whole narrative arc to frame the bits.
yeah, yeah. So that's that. So that's definitely, I was thinking definitely in terms of coherence, and which is why it took me so long, even when I was persuaded, for example, that Colossians 1 works better when read that way. I still needed to know. I'm not going to come out and say that until I know that Matthew 25 can work like that, and Revelation can work like that, and so on. And I need to know that all the parts work coherently, because that's how theology works. And I suppose that's so I'm cautious. I don't. This is why I think I might have said in that book. I mean, I've certainly said it, and I think I've probably written it somewhere. I don't. I always worry when people are instantly persuaded of the truth of universal restoration. I think there's too much stuff to think through. You can't be persuaded that quickly. You need to take your time, don't rush. I would rather you said, "Oh, I'm not sure about that. I need to think about it." Yeah, you really do. Especially that I do think tradition is really important. And I think the tradition, and I did say this in the Evangelical Universalist, the tradition gets the benefit of the doubt. And if the tradition is wrong, the burden of proof is on those who want to show that it's wrong. And
Yes.
so I think the burden of proof, if I'm arguing that the mainstream tradition is wrong, the burden of proof lies on me to show that. Or those, not just me, it lies on people who want to show that. And that's exactly what we have to do. You have to show that it doesn't make sense. It's not rational. It's not coherent. It doesn't make emotional sense. It doesn't make sense of the Bible. It doesn't make sense of Christian theology. Um, and in fact, rather than saying universal restoration is not orthodox, in fact, the exact opposite, in some ironic way, that it's precisely in order to preserve the core elements of orthodoxy that you need to remove eternal hell, because this is like the cuckoo in the nest. It's something that doesn't fit,
Well,
and
I don't think it
it
just, I don't,
threatens the rest of it.
I'm having interesting conversations with a young friend of mine, not that young, but very bright person. He's very close to me. And so he grew up in a American, roughly Christian environment. Um, he's uh, thrown it away. So he would and has been announcing himself as an atheist, but the God that he has rejected, I mean, what made him reject God? He was going to Christian camps that stressed agape, the love of God, and that was giving him faith. And then he went to a Pentecostal church where I don't quite know how, but hell was emphasized. Yeah, I think they were talking about some tribe that was being evangelized and how good it was that they were now saved, or their ancestors weren't. And then just the anomaly of that just absolutely hit him. But this is a God, I can't believe it. This is, and it's very interesting to me that I think I have plenty of anecdotal evidence that what I heard John Milbank say recently in an interview, um, it's actually the belief in hell is among the most significant things that to account for the decline of Christianity, that the incoherence is very much more obvious to those who don't believe. That's what I find.
Yeah, yeah. Although believers struggle with it too. I mean, I think if you didn't struggle with it, there's something wrong with you.
Well,
Oh,
I actually think I mentioned a friend of ours who's a clinical psychologist, and she has become convinced of universal salvation, but a lot of her clientele is in the Bible Belt of Sydney. And I asked her um, what was her view of um, the belief in hell and mental health. And she actually said that she had, a significant number of cases of very earnest young. The more earnest the young Christians are, the more it's a mental health issue. That they have to believe something that is morally shocking, and the ones who get by on it actually are more casual in their faith and probably don't even really believe it in their heart of. I mean, they do believe it, but if you really
mm.
believe it, it would send you mad. I mean,
Yeah, yeah. I agree. I suspect a lot of people say they think it, but they don't actually think it because you can't handle that.
no, no.
So I think Francis Chan says that, didn't he, in the book he did on hell with Preston Sprinkle, where he says, I mean, where he ends up defending hell, but he didn't want to face it, so it's too much to handle, so you bury it.
Yeah,
You
you
don't
bury
think
it.
it.
You
Um,
bury it. So,
you have to, really.
it is. Well, I suppose dear old David, who, as we know, doesn't spare the horses on this, says, well, it's just a monstrous God that's being suggested.
Well, yeah, it is, and actually, and I had an appendix in the second edition of the Evangelical Universalist where I argue that it's also a problem in that in order to justify it, to justify God, you end up defending things that you think are morally indefensible. And it actually becomes a means of, rather than spiritual formation, it becomes a means of spiritual deformation. You have to make yourself callous towards other people. And you think this, that in itself, I think, is suggestive that there's something wrong. If you're having to make yourself less Christ-like in order to live with this doctrine, and less to be able to cope with it psychologically, less caring about other people, less concerned about them because you couldn't handle their loss. Actually, just as an aside, there's a book coming out. It's going to the press today, I think. I signed it off yesterday. Eric Raytan, a philosopher, very, very good philosopher, lovely person, and beautifully clear, has written a book called oh gosh, now I've forgotten. What I tell you what it's about, and the title might come to me. Raytan is spelled Reitan, and it's about the problem of how can heaven be truly happy. I mean, truly like the perfection of happiness if people you love are in hell. So it's a sort of classic problem, but especially since the 19th century. And he examines all the attempts to show how it could be and shows that they're all lacking and really explores that problem at some length. But it's really, really good book. It's called the Grief of Heaven's Grief, or oh gosh. I'll send you a link and you can.
I'll do that. Yeah.
I hope he never sees it. So yeah, how could you have forgotten the title of my book? You only saw it yesterday.
Well, I mean, one of the things that strikes me, people try to defend that by suggesting we get some kind of amnesia in heaven, and which is just a fallacious argument. But the most obvious error in that is, well, clearly God doesn't. The unhappiest person in heaven will have to be God. Um, he would be in eternal misery, um, um,
Yeah, having failed.
having failed, and
Not failed to bring people to the goal for which he created them, the
yeah,
destiny for which he created them.
yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah,
So,
and and it didn't make sense anyway of us. I mean, if you think about it, think of all the people, think of all the people I would know that wouldn't be in heaven, or um, then if my memory of my life now and of how I was redeemed by Christ now, my memory of coming to know the Lord is full of bits which make no sense if you remove all the people who wouldn't be there. So
yeah.
God would be blanking. It'd be like a Swiss cheese with holes all over it. My memory would be incoherent because all of these people who are part of that causal web are gone. Just lots of blank spaces and things happening for no reason. So it would make no sense. So I would have an incoherent memory of how I came to love Christ. So God would have to basically obliterate my entire memory of anything that happened before the new creation.
Yes, indeed, indeed, and uh, um, uh, I know when Anne was going through a terrible case of shingles, which you know about. It was the pain was, as one doctor described, suicidal for about 10 weeks. And I had no idea how she got through it. And I mean, I was utterly shaken and depressed. She was comatose within the huge number of drugs she was taking to try to suppress the pain, and the spasms would cut through that. And the only thing that would help in that pain was ice, actually. So even at night, I had buckets of ice, and I'd lie awake waiting for her to erupt in pain again to grab the ice and put it on her. And okay, I love her very much, but we all know what it's like to try to alleviate someone else's suffering. We all know that is love. Even on a scale like that, how on earth it is uh, comprehensible that billions of people are in, whether it's physical or spiritual agony like that, with absolute. The worst part about what we went through was there was no light at the end of the tunnel, because
Yeah, right.
nobody could tell us when it would be over. or even if it would ever be over. And it's still, in a way, not at 7 years. But that that was just awful. And to say, well, this is the destiny, hopelessness, is it just doesn't bear thinking about. Anyway,
No.
we're convincing
I mean,
each
that's
other.
Jonathan Edwards makes that point in his Sin is in the Hands of an Angry God to sort of strike terror into the hearts of his audience. And that's the most harrowing bit, where he says, he talks about all these tens of thousands of years that you've been suffering like this. And that's nothing. I mean, it's no end. It's just go on like this for eternity, forever. And you think, holy cow. I mean, that's insane. I mean, that is horrific. And well, I mean, at multiple levels. Now, of course, you don't have to construe hell in that way. So most defenses of hell try and avoid that
Yes, they
because,
make it like a Sunday school picnic where we forgot to bring the wine or something.
yeah, or it's just boring, or maybe you even kind of enjoy it in your own way because you kind of perversely enjoying the,
Yeah.
so there are ways of, but they don't work for other reasons. But don't want to get sidetracked
But
into.
if we go back to now, you having gone through, look, one question that occurred to me when you were looking at scripture, apart from Talbot, were you influenced by reading anyone else at this time, or was it a lonely journey?
Um, well, lonely in the sense that I couldn't find anyone else who was. Oh, there was a guy called Jan Bonder. He did a book Erdman's published that was sort of Reformed theology and had some stuff that was quite helpful, I found. But no, I mean, I didn't know anyone else who was arguing what I was. But I found lots of useful stuff in lots of different biblical scholars. So I would read and I think, oh, that's right there. That kind of makes it. And I don't think they kind of connected up the dots the way I was connecting up the dots, but I was finding lots of useful ideas and lots of different biblical scholars. Um, for example, on the stuff on Ionios and what that means. I mean, there are lots of people who believe in hell who dispute the traditional everlasting thing about Ionios. So it was quite easy to find biblical scholars who would provide material that gave you stuff that would help
Yes.
enlighten the text, even if they themselves weren't necessarily weren't thinking about universalism and
Yeah.
stuff like
Yeah.
that. And there are other biblical scholars who were not universalists, but who would argue this particular text is universal. Paul here is being universalist, and they'd say, and he's not being consistent with himself somewhere else. Um, so I'd think, well, actually, he is being consistent with himself, but it's quite helpful to see the arguments you've got as to why he's being universalist here.
Yeah.
So I was able to sort of patch together, I guess, a Frankenstein's monster of theology. I guess that's what my theology is a Frankenstein's monster stitched together from bits of other people's
No, 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 no.
work.
Not a Frankenstein's monster. A much better analogy would be The Wasteland, the great poem by T.S. Eliot. I did my honours thesis at university on it, and that is patched together by Ezra Pound from all sorts of snippets that Eliot wrote. It's virtually co-authored, but the majesty of this, possibly the greatest poem of the most famous poem of the 20th century, is it was Pound, as the better craftsman, Eliot said, taking snippets of his and putting them together into a wonderful ensemble.
I
And
have read
yeah.
it, and I
Mhm.
didn't understand it.
I know. Oh well, let's not get onto the wasteland now.
Really hard. I even read a book about it, and I still didn't understand it.
Uh,
But I will go with that. I'll take that. So maybe not Frankenstein's monster,
yeah,
or
yeah,
perhaps the Bride of Frankenstein. Sounds a bit
yeah.
more romantic, doesn't
A
it?
bit more romantic. So when you came to these conclusions, as you were coming to them, I mean, did it worry you that you were out on a limb? Did you sort of feel precarious? Did you?
No,
Yeah.
no, I didn't mind that at all. Uh, no, I felt great because I felt now I can worship God, and it kind of, and I felt I had hope, and um, hope, as you said earlier, is really essential.
Yeah.
Um, I worried what other people thought? No, not for me. I was worried for the company I worked for. So I was running Paternoster Press, which was an evangelical publishing, well, previously a publisher, but now it was an imprint of another company. And it, and I was very conscious, and so I wasn't using the press to put forth my ideas or anything. I didn't publish my own books. I published other people's books, but I wasn't using it to promote universalism at all, nor did I have any intention of doing so. But the fact that the person who was sort of shaping the kind of output of the company had heretical views could pose a problem for the company, which I didn't want to do. So that's why the book was published under a pseudonym.
Right. A
Uh,
pseudonym of Gregory MacDonald. You,
Gregor MacDonald, yeah, because it wasn't to protect me. Guy can care less what people thought about me. Um, it was to protect the company and its reputation, and so that the buyers could have confidence in the stuff we were doing.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that was the only thing I was worried about. And in fact, people often think, and people often say to me, "So did you get a lot of flack, when you came out and said it was you?" And I got some, but not much, really. I mean, I wish I had had some more. In that I feel bad because other people I know have had a lot, especially in America. I didn't get loads, and partly because of my job, because it meant I kind of had to hang out and network with lots of evangelical theologians in Europe and England and America and stuff, Scotland, and, well, yeah, but blah blah, Australia. Um, I actually knew a lot of the conservative thinkers and got on well with them. So when this book first came out, I remember there was the first time I saw it referenced anywhere was in Christianity Today magazine, and it was clearly someone who hadn't read it. They were just looked at the title and were horrified, and they were like, "Look at the state of evangelicalism today." Someone can even write the Evangelical Universalist. I mean, which is obviously an oxymoron. I mean, it's obviously stupid, right? Um, and so that was the first reaction. But when I came out and said it was me, suddenly all these people, they couldn't just dismiss it, you see, because they already liked me, and a lot of them respected me. Um, and so they had to go, well, at least if it was him, then we'll have to at least read it. So that was quite helpful because it meant that they couldn't just dismiss it and they read it. And when they did read it, a lot of them, even some really conservative folk, were going, well, we think you're wrong. But we do actually think that's an evangelical view, which they hadn't previously thought. So I persuaded them that it was an evangelical view,
Yeah.
which I was rather pleased at because that takes the heat out of the conversation then. The gospel isn't at stake anymore. And so once that's the case, then you can have and it doesn't mean it's not an important issue. You can still have it and treat it with the gravity it deserves, but it's not like whether you're a real Christian is at stake or whether you're a
Well,
Bible believer is at stake.
that's really interesting. That's been my experience when you know someone, it it very much softens your view that there's a person behind the views, and I think
Yeah,
that's really providential that these people were friends of yours around the world because of your job. I mean, professionally.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um, but what you've just said, I really concur with. I mean, I I'm fully convinced of cosmic redemption, but I don't like defining myself as if that's the flag I fly under. I prefer, much broader titles than that. And I feel but what I do feel has happened is that um, the church has flattened out and broadened the number of non-negotiable doctrines, and that has killed discourse. It's killed. I think Van Balthasar has a wonderful phrase, the Republic of the Free Mind, or something like that. I mean, so see, there's these undiscussables. I mean, we're talking here about universal salvation, but if you're in Sydney, it may well be women ministry, or it could be
Can't
anything.
believe that people are still discussing that.
Yeah,
But there you go.
well, they
Yeah,
certainly are.
I
So
know they are. Yeah,
but 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 if you say, well, look, there's grey areas, what that does, I think, is drive a deeper core, as Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15. I've given you what I received. Christ was crucified and rose again the third day. And that's the core, and that's that deep fundamental from which many implications flow. And it's not a bad thing, because that exploration of the ripples of that is actually very nourishing, liberating. In a sense, there are no horizons. But if you take the heat out of an argument, say, well, this is something that, as you and I would know, I mean, what I think that the value of Ilaria's work, one of the many values, is to say, well, some of the greatest theologians in the history of the church believed in this,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
clearly it's got nothing to do with whether or not you're a Christian.
No, no, quite. And that was one of the other 4 points you raised at the beginning was tradition.
Yeah.
Was that actually it's the recovery of some of the patristic universalists that's brought universalism to prominence again, particularly within Catholicism and Orthodoxy,
Yes.
where they take those folks seriously. The rediscovery of the universalism in the early church means you oh, okay. So we can't just rule that out. And the fact that they came to it through Christian reflection,
Mhm.
um, reflecting on the gospel is what led them to it. And it's that kind of thing. I mean, it's that kind of thing that makes people think, well, this is at least something that's arising from reflection on Christian faith, not something that's being imposed on it. At least, you might want to argue that it is being imposed, but you can't argue that the people who are doing it, like us, are doing it because we're trying to impose something. We think we're doing it through reflecting on. And so at least, unless you think nastily about other people, they've got to at least think charitably about us.
They have to,
We're trying to do the right thing, even if we're doing it wrong.
and their reflections are like Maximus, Gregory, are just so profound. Their love of God, their love of Christ is cosmic in its proportions. That's what I always find.
Yeah, yeah. And the importance of holiness because one of the things, oh, well, why, if you didn't have hell, why would you behave? I mean, but look at, people like Origen and so on. I mean, they're super into being holy.
Yeah,
It didn't stop them being holy. I mean, the whole point of salvation is to be transformed into the image of Christ. That's what it's all about. So
that's right. That's
what-
right.
we've reduced it to being saved from being punished in hell, which is such a collapsed version of what's in scripture and the tradition. It's quite impoverished.
Well, it's
But
very interesting that the point you've just raised. The thought that the only reason anyone behaves well is to escape punishment. I mean, common sense, if you're a teacher or an educator or a coach, no, everyone knows that negative motivations never work. That if someone
mm,
is doing any task merely to avoid a problem, the get out of jail problem, you're not doing the task wholeheartedly, and you will manipulate your way around it, and you won't be very inspired. You
no,
know, positive psychology has taught me, and it's deep in us, that doing something for positive reasons, because I love and I desire them, that's when you get high performance. That's when you really deny yourself to do something. I mean, sport is now full of examples of that.
Yeah. You go the extra mile because you want to do it. You,
Well, not just that, but I tell people like I love golf and I'm a tragic, but yeah, if the last thought in your mind is don't hit the ball in the water, um, y we all know what's going to happen. You actually cannot frame the
right.
goal
Yeah, yeah,
negatively.
yeah,
You have to frame it positively.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
it's even worse on things like riding a bike or uh,
Yeah, right, right.
other
Yeah.
sports. So, okay, well, just to finish off then, the book and writing the book, when have you begun to see since you wrote the book, which was around about when, 2000 or so?
2006. Came out in 2006, I think.
2006. I've got the second edition here. What's interesting is that um, I think Oliver Crisp wrote the forward for this, and yet I don't think Oliver's a Universalist. I'm not sure if he is or he isn't, but
He wasn't when he wrote that.
is he
I'm
now?
not saying anymore.
Huh? Say no
I'm
more.
not, I'm not saying anymore.
No, but the good I've noticed the same thing about uh, who wrote the forward for Larger Hope about Balcom. Um,
Richard Borkham, yeah.
yeah, and I don't know if he is or he isn't, but what I liked about both people is that this going back to what we talked about, they seem open-minded. This has
Yeah.
got to be on the table and is valid to discuss.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Richard wrote an article in the 70s on some of this stuff. I mean, like historical. He was a historical theologian before he was a biblical scholar. And and he, he talked about universalism and he didn't agree with it, at least then, I think. But no, and I don't think he is from his Revelation book. I suspect that he thinks it's I don't know. I never spoke to him directly about it, but I suspect that he thinks it's something that that might be,
Mm.
but it might not be. And in the end, it kind of depends on creaturely freedom. I think, it's a possible future, and we can't say that it won't happen. I mean, I suspect, but he might have changed his mind. I mean, I don't know. He's a very creative, fruitful thinker.
He's a great thinker, but what I'm saying is that I value the fact that these people are not pigeonholing it as a heresy, but actually clearly it's something to be considered.
Yeah, yeah. And on the heresy thing, the best thing is that amazing article by Al Kimmel on the Fifth Ecumenical Council, which is published in his book, the title of which I've also forgotten.
I've got it.
Oh, you got it? Okay, so the chapter on that is
Destined for
terrific.
Joy. The book is Destined for Joy.
Destined for Joy. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, yeah. It's just so good because he's done all the work for us. He's read everything and put it all together, and turns out it's not heresy. So that's the short good
Good,
news.
good.
Yeah.
Um, finally, uh, how do you think things have changed since you first went through your journey in terms of universal salvation? Do you feel it's becoming uh, more popular, or is there more interest in it?
Definitely. Unquestionably. Um, yeah, I mean, everywhere I go, I meet people who are talking about, I mean, everywhere I go in Christian circles. Obviously, outside of that, no, but in Christian circles, among people who read theology and think about theology, okay, narrowing it down more. Um, in those circles, yeah, definitely a lot more receptivity to it, including in evangelical circles.
Hmm.
I mean, you see something of that. I think Rob Bell's book, was it 2011 or whenever it came out, but Love, Love Wins.
Love
Was that
wins.
it? Yeah,
He
that
was
one.
castigator for that, wasn't he?
Oh, he was. But he opened the question. He made it a question that people were talking about. And in a sense, the stuff that I was doing and other people were doing kind of rode on the back of that. I mean, it was already out there. So people were going, well, if Rob Bell's raised all these questions, I mean, here's someone who's got some more, more to say about it. So read that as well. And people would read that. And so it got, it's, I have no idea how many people have read it. I'm not a clue because I never have kept track of sales. So I don't know what they are. I mean, I don't even know a ballpark of what they are. But it seems to have been read by a lot of people and who are interested in it. I mean, like, not sure about it, some of them, but quite a few people I meet go, well, don't tell anyone because of where I teach or whatever, but I agree with you. So that's quite nice. And you see something of this shift in the fact that Zondervan did a two views on hell book um, back in the day. I forget the date, which is good, but universalism wasn't even considered a view to be part of the discussion. It was annihilation or eternal hell. That was the only discussion that there was to be had. But then they did a four views on hell book, which was really only a three views on hell book plus a chapter on purgatory. Um, and that had universalism in. That
Mm.
would have been unthinkable. I mean, the very fact that it's considered worth being part of the conversation was unthinkable. And Preston Sprinkle, who edited it, said in his afterword in the book that he didn't agree with me. I was arguing for universalism, but what I had clearly shown is that it was an evangelical view, and that's not a question. And I thought, well, that's quite a bold thing to say in a book published by a very established conservative evangelical publisher. Um, yeah, so I see this a lot. I mean, the temperature has changed a lot, and I think partly because uh, it once you take the sting out of it and clarify exactly what it does and doesn't mean, and it becomes an issue that's open for discussion, then it becomes more a matter of what are we exegeting these texts correctly and so on. And it turns out that it's a lot harder to argue for the traditional view than traditionalists think and had thought. They just kind of taken it for granted and assumed that people wouldn't really question it. And they're still really struggling to put together a coherent response. So there was a response, a massive two-volume work by Michael McClymond, um, The Devil's Redemption. And Michael is a lovely chap. I mean, from the times I've met him, seems to be a lovely chap. And he sent me the stuff he'd written about me in the book to check that I agreed that he was representing me correctly, so he was being fair. And he was clearly disagreeing with me, but I was the universalist who he was nicest to. He was quite harsh on a lot of people, but me, I was just wrong. I can't remember. I mean, for various reasons, he thought I was wrong. But he didn't think I was as dangerously wrong as some others. But anyway, this is the big conservative evangelical response to universalism. And on the one hand, it's an amazing piece of work because there's so much research in it. It's really impressive that one brain can do all of this work and pull it all together. So it's a great resource. Um, but it also exposes the great weakness of that position and really reinforces the case for universalism for two reasons, really. Well, three reasons, and I will tell you them very quickly. Well, they're really two reasons, but one's in two parts. The first one is that his main case against universalism is that it's importing. It's not arising from reflection on the gospel. It's an importation in the early church of Gnosticism and that kind of stuff. And in the more modern revival of universalism, it really tracks back to the esotericism of Yakov Burma. Um, and so that's where it's really rooted, and that's where it's coming from, and that's what he tried to demonstrate. The problem is on both of those counts, despite his massive reading and research, he is demonstrably wrong. I think. And so Laria and I try and show some of the problems with those two claims in the appendices to our book. And there are various other people who've written articles responding. And then the other problem is his positive theological case against universalism in the book, which I have an online article responding to. Um, Almost every point is weak. And And that was really disappointing because that's the sort of climax of the book. This is why the theology of universalism is wrong. And no disrespect to Michael. I mean, he knows that we don't agree. And he's a genuinely good scholar. But these are not good arguments. They really don't do the work that they need to do to get to the conclusion. So when I read it, I was greatly relieved. I was reading it thinking, am I wrong? Am I going to find out that I was wrong about all this stuff? And I finished it and thought, oh, thank goodness for that. So if that's the best that can be done, I'm greatly relieved.
Yes,
That kind of reinforced my conviction, having
I
read that.
haven't read it in. I haven't read all of it. I read quite a lot of it. I was stunned when he, opened up with this Gnostic origins. I mean, I just my jaw dropped. I thought you can't build 900 pages on that. It's not true in my experience or anyone else I know.
Uh, yeah, no, I mean, I understand some of the stuff he was saying. This exegesis of this text doesn't, Parry's exegesis of this doesn't really work. He thinks it makes more sense in a different way. And yeah, there is a real discussion to be had there. I mean, I'm not saying that none of the points he makes I don't want to dismiss them all. Um, but the general thrust of it and the basic theological arguments were, I thought, woefully inadequate. And I try to explain the reasons I think that in this online article, which I can't remember what I called that either, but
I'll
it's
have a,
called something, and it's on my academia page.
okay, well, I'll search it out and read it. I might have read it already, but
Yeah, yeah, you might have done.
yeah, it's
It's not riveting. It was. I don't write about stuff like that most of the time. I write about ecology and things, and that's my thing.
well, on another occasion, let's chat about that. But well, thank you very much for your time, Robin, and
You're welcome.
for your work. We enjoy it a lot.
Yeah, I always love you to chat, Tony. Thank you for having me.
Okay, we'll talk again, my friend. Take care.
Bye.